A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is taken from a presentation I did at the Western History Association conference in Kansas City at the end of October. I hope you enjoy it, and please reach out to me if you have any questions. I'm happy to expand on some of the things that get brought up in this brief presentation. So in the late 1820s and 30s, as Mexico emerged from its struggle for independence, the lessening of official trade restrictions opened the doors to foreign sailors, merchants, and adventurers who soon found themselves dealing with the web of family networks that formed the backbone of Spanish-American society. Before that, say before 1820, Spain had a very restrictive regimen in terms of who could come into its territories, who could trade. But with independence, Mexico saw itself needing and desiring to bring in not only trade, but immigrants into its territories, as we saw in the case of Texas or other places. Now, as I mentioned, people who came at that time, and it was almost entirely men, had to deal with different networks, which often blurred the lines between family and commerce, family and business. And these networks, these personal social networks, were very common and particularly tight-knit in California, in Mexican California, where the small population of Spanish descendants formed a real intricate tapestry of relationships. One man who came to California from Jalisco, from Mexico in 1834, Carlos N. Ijar, whose testimony I read on the podcast earlier, remarked the following, quote, "Everyone called each other cousin, even though no bond of relationship united them," unquote. So it was into this world of intertwined families that two English-speaking newcomers, James Alexander Forbes and John Marsh, would make their mark. Their stories, while they're parallel in many ways, diverge in some crucial aspects, and they give us a glimpse into the different strategies that foreigners, especially English speakers, could and did adopt in Mexican California, and the consequences of these choices in the turbulent years that followed the U.S. Mexico War and California's annexation. Now, Forbes and Marsh both arrived in California in the 1830s. They were both well-educated and ambitious. They shared a common tongue, as I mentioned, English, but they were also fluent in Spanish, which wasn't always very common. And that was a skill that proved invaluable in their adopted home. Both men came from elite backgrounds and were driven to achieve positions of status in their new environment. But despite these similarities, Forbes and Marsh chose different approaches to integrating or not integrating into Californio society. One, James Alexander Forbes, opted to become an insider, while the other, John Marsh, remained decidedly on the outside. So let's start with James Alexander Forbes. Now, he was born in Scotland in 1805, and before coming to Alta California in 1831, he had lived in Spain with relatives, and so he had a tie to the Spanish-speaking world and Latin America. So it seems that he knew Spanish already years before coming, and he had been acculturated to Latin America. Now, when he arrived in California, he quickly immersed himself in local life, and he took a job working for the Castro family on Rancho San Pablo, which is in present-day Contra Costa County. In 1832, he began working as a clerk for Padre Jose Biader at Mission Santa Clara. And in working for Biader, he rose to the position of mayordomo, which was basically a foreman who oversaw the mission itself. Now, he traveled on behalf of the mission and on mission business, and that caused him to make the acquaintance of many of the key members of California society at the time. And this role proved crucial in Forbes's integration into California culture. He reflected on this years later at one of the hearings of the United States Land Commission. And he said, quote, "My work is such as to cause me to be intimately acquainted with the native California population and to ascertain their reputation." So he had insights into people's reputations, and this was very important. Now, Forbes' willingness to embrace California culture extended beyond his professional life. In 1833, he received Mexican citizenship, and then the next year, in 1834, he married Ana Maria Galindo, who was a Californiana, a Mexican Californian woman from a prominent local family. Forbes wasn't unusual in marrying into an influential Hispanic family, as this was a common strategy among men like him who came to California from the Pacific, often on trading vessels. This marriage, along with Forbes' active participation in various aspects of California life, including serving as a godfather at numerous baptisms, helped his position as an insider in Californio society. And notice, I'm making a distinction here between California and Californio society. So Californio society means really those family networks of Spanish-speaking Californians. His connections and reputation both inside and outside California led to his appointment as the British government's official representative in Mexican California. And he held this position from 1842 to 1850, 8 years. Now, switching gears, John Marsh's journey to California, on the other hand, was more circuitous. He was born in Danvers, Massachusetts in 1799 and attended Harvard College from 1819 to 1823, and he earned a bachelor's degree there. Though he studied medicine, he never received a formal medical degree or certificate. He had a restless personality and he eventually headed west, where he worked as an Indian agent for the Sioux Agency at Fort Snelling in what is today Minnesota. There, he had a child with a woman who was part Sioux native. He eventually left both his wife and son behind and came to California in 1836, following the Santa Fe Trail to the Pueblo of Los Angeles. Now, in Los Angeles, Marsh began practicing medicine, which was what he knew how to do, and he quickly accumulated enough wealth to purchase, thanks to his medical practice, a 17,000-acre rancho, Los Meganos, in what is now Contra Costa County. He purchased the ranch. He didn't receive a land grant, so important distinction. Now, he left Los Angeles soon after and took on a new role as both a rancher and a doctor. Soon, Marsh began to travel extensively throughout Northern California, from Sonoma to Monterey, more or less, and he would treat patients for a wide variety of ailments. And he earned the respect of influential citizens such as Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, who was a key power broker in northern Alta California. Cash was scarce in Mexican California, so Marsh devised a payment system whereby he charged in cattle. So a typical visit might cost one head of cattle, while if he had to travel to a more distant location, he might charge up to 2 or 3 head of cattle for his services. The Californios, while they didn't like this very much and they considered these fees to be exorbitant, were sort of over a barrel, and they valued his services enough to pay. This allowed Marsh to amass a considerable herd of cattle and establish himself as an important and influential rancher in the region. Unlike Forbes, however, Marsh had a posture of aloofness from California society, and that extended to his stance on marriage. According to his biographer, Marsh said that he would never marry he used a racial slur. I'm going to leave it out. But he said he wouldn't marry one of them and preferred to marry his, quote, own kind. And that's a sentiment that underscored his persistent stance vis-a-vis integration into Californio society. Marsh remained a bachelor for many years until he married a woman named Abigail Tuck of Chelmsford, Massachusetts in 1851. And by that time, Marsh himself was about 52 years old. Now, Abigail, or as she was known, Abby, had a daughter with John Marsh. And sadly, Abby died in 1855 due to illness, leaving Marsh to care for his young daughter, Alice. Now, the different strategies employed by Marsh and Forbes toward the local social fabric profoundly affected their roles within the community. James Alexander Forbes, with his deep connections and cultural adaptability, became a sort of facilitator, an indispensable one, in many transactions, including land grants from the Mexican government. His bilingual skills helped him be a valuable witness in legal cases after the U.S. annexed California. And, that was a time when the Californios found themselves struggling to prove that they owned the land that they'd been granted, right? And Forbes, who was both fluent in Spanish but also knew the community really well, was very much relied upon in this role. Because, of course, he was also a native English speaker, came from the UK, and so he could navigate the two worlds, even though he wasn't American. Marsh also became indispensable in his own way to the community through his medical practice, but he maintained a more transactional relationship with his neighbors. His focus was primarily on building a network of fellow Americans in Mexican California, and he pursued that goal pretty vigorously. As early as 1840, he began writing letters to contacts back east, and he encouraged Americans to emigrate to California. He talked about the weather. He talked about the abundance of Native American labor. He really tried to bring Americans who were interested in setting out from the east to populate California. His letters were published in Midwestern newspapers, particularly in Missouri, and they played a real significant role in attracting settlers to the region. So much so that Marsh's ranch became the endpoint of what came to be called the California Trail. But his outsider status and his reputation, also among new American arrivals, for inhospitality often led to resentment, though. John Bidwell, who came to California in 1841 with the first big overland immigrant party, and who arrived partially thanks to Marsh's letters and even stayed at Marsh's ranch on arrival, recounted an incident that illustrated Marsh's precarious social standing among the local community. According to Bidwell, when Marsh brought some of his hides to a nearby pueblo to be sold, he was so unwelcome among the other ranchers that he was forced to sleep under his own cart. Now, as Mexico's grip on Alta California began to weaken, and I say Alta California here because, of course, the peninsula of Baja California was also part of the Californias. But for the purposes of this podcast, we speak about California We're mainly talking about what is today the state of California. So, as Mexico's grip on California began to weaken, Alta California, both Forbes and Marsh recognized that the territory had an uncertain future, and they did their best to try and see if they could influence its destiny. Their visions for that destiny, however, were pretty different. Forbes, who was loyal to his adopted home and his Scottish roots, hoped to see California thrive, but under British influence. As British vice consul, he wrote to his superiors in September of 1844 the following, quote, "I feel myself in duty bound to use all my influence to prevent this fine country from falling into the hands of any other foreign power than that of England," unquote. Forbes believed that only through significant reforms, including the introduction of, quote, "moral, industrious settlers and good soldiers commanded by good officers from Mexico," unquote, could the territory be saved from what he termed, quote, "the inundation of the scum of the population of the U.S., unquote. So Forbes held out hope that Mexico could reform the territory if it sent the right people, right? And he really had an idea of U.S. settlers as being pretty undesirable. The scum of the population of the U.S. That's pretty bad. Now, Marsh, on the other hand, envisioned California following the path that was laid out by Texas. His plan was pretty ambitious, and it conceived of uniting California and Oregon together into a single independent nation with its capital on the San Francisco Bay. With this in mind, on March 27th of 1845, Marsh issued a call to all Americans living in northern Alta California to come meet up in the pueblo of San Jose on July 4th, U.S. Independence Day, to discuss his proposal. Now, not much really came of this, but his idea and his efforts caught the attention of the U.S. consul in Alta California, Thomas Larkin, who was in San Francisco, and who later contacted Marsh to enlist his aid in trying to obtain California for the U.S., for the United States. As tensions between the United States and Mexico escalated in the subsequent months, Marsh and Forbes found themselves on different sides of history. Marsh was taken aback by the disorder and violence of the Bear Flag Revolt and Captain John C. Fremont's role in supporting it. And you can go back and listen to or watch my podcast on the Bear Flag Revolt and Fremont and who he was and how he was involved. So Marsh didn't like the way that played out, but he ultimately welcomed U.S. annexation. His vision of California was that it become ultimately part of the United States, and it was realized, though not in the manner he had planned. For his part, Forbes made a last-ditch effort to secure British protection for California, and he used his influence with Mexican California Governor Pio Pico to persuade him to make a formal request for that protection. But by the time Pico acted, U.S. forces had already taken control of northern Alta California. So what is today, from Sonoma down to Monterey. And the British government had instructed its ships to stay out of it. To his chagrin, Forbes was ordered to remain neutral as a representative of Great Britain. And he was a diplomat, so he maintained good relationships with both the Californios and the new American occupation force. In the words of Russell Posner, who wrote an article about Forbes and his attempts to get a British protectorate going for Alta California, he said Forbes' efforts were an utter failure. according to Posner, they probably would have been doomed even if he had encouragement from his home government. As it was, Forbes had the unenviable role of being a helpless spectator to the successful American takeover of the province. Where he failed, people like Larkin, Commodore Sloat, Naval Commander Sloat, Naval Commander Stockton, and Captain Fremont, all U.S. officers, succeeded. Now, we could add John Marsh's name to that list, because his plan also succeeded to some degree. But that was just the first part. The aftermath of the annexation and the subsequent gold rush brought a harsh new set of challenges for both men. Ironically, Marsh, like the Mexican Californio rancheros whom he disdained, also found himself having to defend his title to his rancho against squatters, Anglo-American squatters who came and settled in his land. In addition, according to his biographer, Marsh's biographer, the local judges and juries seemed to be squarely in the hands of those squatters who, truth be told, flooded into the state in part thanks to the letter-writing campaigns of Marsh himself. But perhaps his most significant legal difficulty arose from a dispute with his neighbor, Ignacio Cibrian, whose Rancho San Miguel butted up against his. Now, the conflict, which centered around Marsh's alleged refusal to pay Cibrian's vaqueros for their services on his ranch, like branding and taking care of the cattle, led to a lawsuit. Now, Marsh won the case, but the animosity it generated had fatal consequences for him. In September of 1856, Marsh was murdered, presumably by the same vaqueros who had sued him. And his death left behind a young orphan daughter, Alice, who we mentioned before. Forbes, for his part, became involved in a venture called the New Almaden Quicksilver Mercury Mine, a project that would test both his finances and ultimately tarnish his reputation with English speakers in California. The complex legal battles and financial maneuverings surrounding the mine, which is outside of San Jose today. In fact, there's a park you can go and visit to see the remains of that mine. And the mine was ultimately nationalized by President Lincoln. But all the troubles arising from that venture occupied most of Forbes' later years. And it challenged the social and political capital he had built up over decades in California. As California entered a new era under American rule, the legacies of Forbes and Marsh took different paths. Forbes, despite being criticized by some Anglo-Americans for his involvement in the whole mining venture, which it'd be very interesting to do a podcast episode about, continued to maintain high standing among Hispanic Californians, even for decades later. His position as a man who had fully embraced and contributed to Californio society endured well past the 1850s, thanks in part to the key role he played as a mediator between the Hispanic, Spanish-speaking, and English-speaking communities. Marsh, on the other hand, gained a reputation as, quote, the meanest man in California. That's also from Bidwell. And his outsider status and transactional approach to relationships did little to endear him either to his Spanish-speaking neighbors or the new English-speaking settlers. In the end, the lives of James Alexander Forbes and John Marsh are a study in contrasts. Both men saw great potential in California's future, and they sought to influence it, but their different approaches, Forbes as a weaver of the existing social fabric, and Marsh as someone who tried to replace it, led to drastically different outcomes for each of them. Marsh, for example, His efforts helped secure the territory for the U.S., and his dreams for California were realized. But the violence of the era that he helped usher in eventually caught up with him. Forbes, whose political goals were defeated, died at home in Oakland in 1881 at the age of 77, having been married for 47 years, having fathered 12 children, 10 of whom survived him. And those children, those numerous bicultural children, helped continue to weave the fabric of a multi-ethnic society in California for years to come. Now, as I said, this was just a brief overview of two individuals who came to California, Mexican California, and how they survived through the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. There are lots of stories like theirs, and each of those stories is particular in its own way. But I think by looking at these two guys, we can get a good feel for how difficult life was, the types of aspirations that people had, and how not having your goals realized isn't always a formula for defeat. So I hope you found this interesting. Welcome to talk about it. Send me an email, contact me, let me know what you thought, or if you'd like to know more about these two persons or their families. Both of their families also have interesting stories, and we'll keep the conversation going. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code PODCAST, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.